Okay, well, I think because we're just after 2 o'clock, we can probably get started. Thank you to everybody and welcome. Thanks for joining this afternoon in the UK, at least. It's great that you're to see this interest in hearing more about the report that we published earlier this week that was written by our colleague Lydia Heinrichs, who's going to walk us through it today on the important topic of biomass as a use as an alternative feedstock for the chemical sector. We're just, Lydia will do a fairly short presentation, kind of walk through the key points arising from the report, and then there'll be some time for any questions at the end of her presentation. But it's really good to see you all. Just to note, we are recording this for the benefit of people that weren't able to attend, so we can share the recording around afterwards, so you can forward it to any colleagues that are interested but aren't able to attend today. So I think without any further ado, I'll hand over to you, Lydia, to present the report.
Thanks, Penny. And thank you everyone for coming on this summer afternoon. I'm really glad to see you. So yeah, let's get started. I'll just share my screen. Here we go. All right. So, as Penny mentioned, this report is about the use of biomass as a feedstock in the chemical sector and the risks that chemical companies face in using biomass as a feedstock. So just to give a brief overview of the presentation before I start, so I'll start by giving some context about the chemical sector's recent turn to biomass and why we felt it was important to write this report. And then I will discuss briefly some of the sustainability risks involved in the use and production of biomass, including land use risks, emissions, biodiversity, and so on. And then I will discuss how much supply of sustainable biomass is expected to be available in 2050 and whether the chemical sector is considered a priority use of limited supply. And then address some issues with existing biomass governance. And then I will conclude by talking about 3 actions that companies can take to minimize biomass risks. So in scope for the report and for this presentation was the use of biomass as a feedstock in basic chemical production. So the production of ammonia, methanol, and HVCs, so aromatics and olefins. Out of scope was the use of biomass as an energy source, so as a source of heat or power for chemical processes, and also specialty chemicals, although I would say that the sustainability criteria that we lay out in the report are relevant to any biomass sourced for chemical feedstocks and not just for basic chemicals. So, why are chemical companies turning to biomass? So as you are aware, a large portion of the chemical sector's emissions stem from the use of fossil fuels as a source of carbon and hydrogen atoms for chemical molecular structure. And for the chemical sector to align with 1.5 pathways, these are going to have to be replaced with sustainable emissions neutral alternatives. There are a few options, including biomass, but also green hydrogen, captured carbon, and plastic-based. And we are starting to see chemical producers begin to replace fossil feedstocks with a small amount of alternative feedstocks. And so far, the most common alternative has been biomass. So LyondellBasell and BASF are already offering product lines which incorporate a small amount of biomass into their chemical feedstock. And from conversations that we've had with companies, it seems that biomass is probably the main alternative feedstock that they will be using for the foreseeable future. So biomass is a particularly attractive option for companies because it integrates quite easily with existing production processes, particularly steam cracking, so that companies don't have to invest in new infrastructure or in the development of new chemical production processes. But at the same time, biomass also faces some pretty serious sustainability challenges, and the supply of sustainable biomass, both before and by 2050, will be very, very limited. So in this report, we wanted to outline the risks of biomass use and provide some guardrails for companies in their use of biomass. And I just wanted to say here that it is definitely a good thing that companies are beginning to move away from fossil fuels, and this is absolutely what we want to see. We are not saying that companies should not be using biomass at all. We just want to make sure that companies are making the transition to new feedstocks as responsibly and as sustainably as possible, and that they're taking the necessary steps to ensure that the chemical system in the future, in 2050 and beyond, will be as sustainable as possible. From first principles, what is biomass? So biomass in the broadest sense can be defined as any organic matter derived from recently living organisms, as opposed to fossil fuels, which are derived from organisms which have been buried underground for millennia. And it has a wide variety of uses, including as food and animal feed, for timber construction and other wood products, for textiles, for traditional energy uses, such as for fuel, for cooking and energy, and then modern bioenergy, and then finally chemical feedstocks. And it's really important to keep all of these different uses in mind, because all of these are sectors which will be competing for the use of biomass in 2050 and before 2050. So a number of different types of biomass can be used for chemical feedstocks. The first one, which you're probably the most familiar with, are energy crops. So these include crops like corn, sugarcane, rapeseed, oil, palm, and willow, and so on. These are usually processed into biofuels like biogas and biodiesel. And as you can tell, many of them require the use of arable land, which is a concern, as I'll get into in a sec. A second type of biomass is forestry biomass, which is any kind of biomass which is derived from wood, and this can undergo a process called gasification, which releases the carbon and hydrogen atoms in it to be used as a chemical feedstock. And then there are municipal and industrial waste sources of biomass. Oh, I skipped one. Agricultural residues, which are wastes from agricultural harvesting, such as straw, nutshells, husks, and sugarcane bagasse. And then there are municipal and industrial wastes, so municipal organic waste and industrial wastes like used cooking oil, and also agricultural wastes like livestock manure. And finally, there's also aquatic biomass. I don't discuss this in detail in the report because it's currently in the early R&D stages, and there are significant question marks about whether it can be scaled by 2050. So companies are turning to biomass on the assumption that biomass is carbon neutral, or at least is less emitting than fossil fuels. The key assumption here is that the carbon released during the production of chemicals and at the end of life stage will be recaptured through new plant growth, thereby resulting in no net emissions in the atmosphere. So that's the assumption. In reality, biomass is far from automatically carbon neutral, or even low carbon, or even lower carbon than oil and gas feedstocks. So this is a bar graph taken from a recent JRC report, which compared life cycle analyses for PET, that's polyethylene terephthalate, plastic bottles derived from bio-based feedstocks and from non-bio-based feedstocks. So what we're interested in here is the figure over to the left here, the climate change figure, which shows that the climate impacts of PET plastic bottles derived from bio-based feedstocks are comparable to, or even slightly greater than, or can be slightly greater than those from petrochemical PET. And notably, this does not take into account land use change, which is another very significant source of emissions. It is in principle possible for biomass to be emissions neutral, but very strict conditions need to be met. And I lay these out in the report. So so in addition to the emissions risk, there's a number of other sustainability risks which need to be considered. The first is related to land use. So biomass is highly land intensive compared to other non-fossil feedstocks, and land will be an increasingly scarce resource in the years leading up to 2050, particularly as global population grows rapidly in those years. So there's a few reasons why this is a concern. First of all, the use of arable land for growing energy crops directly competes with food production. And so it can contribute to food insecurity by raising food prices or by limiting accessibility of food staples in particular areas. Also importantly, the use of land for biomass production can trigger land use change. So on the one hand, it can directly trigger land use change by displacing other uses of land. For example, when forest is cut down to make way for bioenergy crop production, or when a natural forest is converted to a managed forest used for bioenergy production. But just as importantly, the use of land for biomass production can also indirectly trigger land use change by adding to pressure on land resources in a given area, for example, by driving agricultural production into natural forest or peatland, so on. So land use change has very important consequences for both climate and biodiversity. Natural landscapes are some of the world's most important carbon sinks. And when these landscapes are converted to new uses, most of this carbon is, the carbon that they contain is released into the atmosphere. And wherever natural lands are converted to new uses, it's very unlikely that they will reduce emissions at all compared to the use of fossil fuels. Furthermore, the destruction and fragmentation of species habitats due to land use change is also the single most important driver of global biodiversity loss. Biodiversity, as you may be aware, is currently declining at the fastest rate in human history, and we will not be able to reverse this trend unless we prevent further conversion of natural landscapes, which are home to some of the world's most important ecosystems. So the Food and Land Use Coalition has estimated that in a business as usual scenario, so continuing current trends, an additional 400 million hectares of natural lands will be converted to other uses before 2050. This needs to be avoided at all costs in order to meet climate and biodiversity goals. So it will be really important that as little dedicated land is used for biomass production as possible, and in particular that as little arable land as possible is used for biomass production, especially for energy crops such as corn and sugar. So the second risk is emissions, which I've already touched on briefly, but I just want to go into a little bit more detail. So I've discussed emissions from land use change, but there's also a number of other sources of potential sources of emissions in biomass supply chains. So one is the depletion of soil and forest carbon stocks through intensive harvesting practices, and this is particularly important in the case of forestry biomass. So unlike other forms of biomass, it takes a long time for a sapling to sequester the same amount of carbon as a mature tree. And when harvesting rates exceed the rate of regrowth in a particular forest, then the total amount of carbon that a forest can contain will decline over time, resulting in net emissions to the atmosphere. And in addition, soil organic carbon is often released during harvesting processes through the churning up of soils during with heavy machinery use. And then there's a few other sources of supply chain emissions, so including the use of nitrogen fertilizers during cultivation, which can release nitrous oxide, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. And then also the use of fossil fuels during harvesting and processing of biomass feedstocks, and also their transportation, which can account for a very, very significant portion of a feedstock's overall emissions profile. Risk number 3 is risks to biodiversity. So I've already discussed biodiversity loss caused by land use change, but the cultivation and harvesting of biomass can also have other major consequences for biodiversity. So in general, any managed lands will have very low levels of biodiversity compared to unmanaged lands. And this is for a number of reasons. In the case of croplands, the use, it can be because of the use of crop monocultures or of agrochemicals such as insecticides or herbicides. And in the case of managed forests, harvesting infrastructure such as roads can fragment forest ecosystems, and harvesting processes can alter key features of ecosystems such as canopy cover or the presence of important habitats such as tree stumps. And then also intensive harvesting practices like clear cutting can simply destroy forest ecosystems altogether. And biomass production can also have a range of wider impacts on ecosystems and on communities as well, including the depletion of local water resources, soil erosion and nutrient depletion, and water pollution due to excessive use of nitrogen fertilizers. So given all these risks, what conditions would biomass need to meet in order to be truly sustainable? So we've covered this in some detail in the report, but here I will just outline a few basic principles. The first is that there should be no conversion of natural lands to biomass production in anywhere in the supply chain, which means in particular, no deforestation or peatland conversion, no conversion of natural grasslands, and so on for both biodiversity and climate reasons. Secondly, there should be biomass feedstocks used for chemical production should not be allowed to compete with food production. This has a few implications. The first is that the use of crops which require dedicated land will need to be limited as much as possible, so particularly any energy crops. No arable land should be used for growing biomass. And finally, energy crops will therefore need to be limited to non-food and feed energy crops, which can be grown on marginal and degraded lands. So for example, areas with degraded soils or hillsides or any area which is not being used for other purposes. And then principle 3 is that the use of biomass as a chemical feedstock should not compete with lower carbon uses of biomass, particularly with materials uses of biomass. So the most important point here is that whole trees should not be used for chemical feedstocks. And this is because these trees can also be used for a number of other materials uses, which are lower carbon and need to be reserved for those purposes. So the next one is pretty straightforward. Greenhouse gas emissions need to be minimized across biomass supply chains, for example, by avoiding heavy agrochemical usage and by electrifying supply chains. Principle number 3 is that regrowth periods need to be respected in all harvesting areas. So biomass needs to be allowed to regrow fully prior to harvesting in order to maximize carbon sequestration. And finally, biodiversity needs to be protected in all harvesting areas, for example, by minimizing agrochemical usage, avoiding clear cutting, and minimizing harvesting infrastructure in forests. So given these restrictions, how much sustainable biomass is actually going to be available in 2050? If there's one thing that I'd like you to take home from this report, it's that the amount of sustainable biomass which can be produced without major risks to climate and biodiversity will be extremely limited. So the estimate that we used is drawn from a report written by the Energy Transitions Commission in 2021. And they suggest that only 30 to 50 exajoules of biomass per year may be available by 2050. And to put that number in context, if the chemical sector were to source 100% of its feedstocks for virgin plastic, and that's for virgin plastic alone, from biomass, it would require 34 exajoules per year. That is possibly slightly more than a sustainable supply of biomass. Furthermore, that this is a very, very optimistic estimate of chemical sector demand. So it only accounts for plastics and not for other petrochemical products. So it assumes a 20% demand reduction in virgin plastic production due to economy-wide circularity measures, which is very optimistic. So at the same time, in addition to chemicals, there will be many other sectors competing for the use of biomass to decarbonize, including sectors such as power generation and road transport and building heating and aviation and heavy industry and so on. So limited supplies of biomass will need to be carefully allocated to the sectors which need it the most. So the general principle here is that the use of biomass should be prioritized in sectors where it offers the greatest carbon abatement potential or where other decarbonization options will be limited in 2050. So the general recognition in various studies is that the highest priority use of biomass is as a material. So for example, in timber construction, in wood products, in paper, or in textiles. And this is primarily because these uses do not release any carbon into the atmosphere, and also they can actually sequester carbon for long periods of time, for example, in timber buildings. So the second highest priority use of biomass increasingly recognized to be chemical feedstocks, and this is primarily because alternative decarbonization options will remain very expensive in all likelihood in 2050. And similar, this is also the case for aviation, but it will be very important in both of these sectors that biomass is adopted alongside other decarbonization options in order to avoid overstraining limited supplies of biomass. There are a number of sectors in which biomass is less likely to be a competitive option in 2050. So these include power generation, building heating, and road transport, which currently account for the vast majority of biomass use at the moment. So ensuring that biomass is allocated sustainably across sectors and that strong sustainability guardrails are put in place to prevent unsustainable sourcing will require very robust sustainability governance. But unfortunately, this is not yet in place. So in the report, we discuss some ways in which biomass governance does not fully mitigate sustainability risks. And I won't go into detail on this too much, but just to give an overview. So in terms of sector allocation, unfortunately, financial incentives for biomass use in Europe and elsewhere are highly skewed in favor of low priority sectors such as power generation and road transport. And similar levels of support do not exist for materials and chemicals. So in order to ensure that levels of demand for biomass remain within sustainable limits, it will be really important to see a shift of financial subsidies away from lower priority uses of biomass and towards materials and chemicals, as demand from the chemical sector will come on top of demand from other sectors with a high likelihood of straining existing supply. In terms of sustainability governance, there is currently no global sustainability standard for biomass sustainability, and existing standards are highly fragmented across national borders and also vary greatly in quality. So even the most ambitious sustainability standards, such as the EU RED, which is currently undergoing a revision process, have key areas of oversight. Pretty much universally, all sustainability standards have very weak requirements regarding arable land, and also carbon accounting for forestry feedstocks, as well as very weak restrictions on the specific types of biomass which can be used, the specific types of biomass feedstocks which can be used for energy and feedstock purposes. And in addition, the monitoring and enforcement of biomass supply chains is also quite weak. At the moment, sustainability enforcement depends on very heavily on third-party certification schemes, but these vary widely in quality, and many have been criticized for weak sustainability criteria and for failures of implementation and for lack of transparency. So this lack of robust biomass governance means that it's all the more important for chemical companies to limit their biomass use as much as possible, and also to source their biomass according to very, very strict sustainability criteria, independently of certification schemes. So just to highlight this, I wanted to present a case study which I discuss in the report and use as an example of some of the risks of biomass sourcing and of why it's really important to engage with companies in detail about their sourcing practices, even if their biomass is supposedly certified. So the case study focuses on Drax, which is the largest bioenergy company in Europe and has been receiving millions of pounds worth of handouts from the UK government since 2012. They have a plant based in North Yorkshire. There's a photo on the PowerPoint, which burns woody biomass, primarily imported from the US and Canada. So Drax claims that 98% of its biomass has been certified by the leading woody biomass certification scheme, the Sustainable Biomass Program. But in late 2022, the BBC Panorama program released the results of an investigation into Drax's supply chains, which found that Drax was actually using wood derived from high quality timber that had been clear cut in virgin forests in British Columbia in Canada, and that Drax itself owned the logging licenses to these forests. So we can't be 100% certain that the wood that they were using was certified, but statistically it's highly likely that it was. And studies conducted by a number of environmental groups of the SBP certification program have highlighted some key emissions which could easily lead to failures of implementation of this kind. Again, I won't go into a huge amount of detail here. You can read it in the report, but some of the most important points are that there was no requirement for field verification of sourcing areas. The SBP criteria include very weak protections for old growth forest and areas of high biodiversity importance. And in addition, have very weak carbon accounting requirements, including no requirement to measure the impacts of harvesting on forest carbon stocks. So the point here is not so much to point the finger at a particular certification scheme, but rather to say that you can't assume on the basis of certification that biomass is actually being sourced sustainably. And it's really important for companies to be engaging as directly as possible with their suppliers to ensure that their biomass is being used and is being produced as sustainably as possible. So in light of these risks, what should companies be doing to minimize exposure to biomass risks? So the first point is that companies need to minimize demand for biomass as much as possible and as soon as possible. So this means two things. First of all, companies should support the circular economy by ensuring that their products are fully reusable and recyclable. And this will help to limit overall demand for feedstocks, including biomass feedstocks. Secondly, companies need to be favoring alternative non-fossil raw materials. So for example, renewable hydrogen and carbon in particular, possibly a small, captured carbon in particular, and possibly a small amount of plastic waste if extremely strict conditions are met. Secondly, companies need to be following strict sustainability criteria when they source their biomass, and again, should not be relying on certification schemes to be doing their work for them. And third, companies need to set out a plan to reduce long-term dependence on biomass. So this has two implications. First of all, companies need to scale the use of alternative feedstocks as quickly as possible. And then second, companies need to be investing in processes which are compatible with renewable feedstocks, and in particular in renewable methanol production, and also in methanol to olefins and methanol to aromatics processes. And these we discussed in our early reports on the chemical industry. So finally, what should investors do? First, you can challenge companies to publish detailed short and long-term strategies about their feedstock use, and in order to ensure that they are reducing their biomass dependence as much as possible. And secondly, demand that companies source their feedstocks according to the strictest possible sustainability criteria. And as I said, we outline these in detail in the report. And you can also see the report for a detailed list of engagement questions, which you can use in your meetings with chemical companies. So that is it for me. Thanks very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Lydia. That was a really great run through of all the main points from the report. I don't know whether people have had a chance to have a look at it before coming onto the webinar today, and you will have seen, hopefully, Lydia sent an email around just before this webinar with a summary one-pager, kind of summarising the key points, which hopefully will be a useful reference point for people. But yes, as Lydia says, if you've got questions, we've got some time now for people to put those to Lydia. Looks as though you were crystal clear, Lydia. No questions coming up straight away. Well, if there are no questions at this point, we can give you 10 minutes of your time back today, and the offer is open, obviously, to take any questions that may arise once you've had a chance to absorb what was in the report, and to read it as well. Hopefully, Lydia would be happy, I assume, to take any questions at any point from people. But we hope that this report will be useful. We'll be sharing a recording of it, of the webinar, that people can share with colleagues or other interested parties. And thank you very much for your time and attending this afternoon.
Thank you very much. It's really clear.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mark.
Right.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Take care.
See you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.